Look at this soldier. He's the perfect Aryan, one of man's elite warriors. Blue-eyed, steel-jawed, the perfect example of racial superiority. One who will carry the banner of National Socialism into the racially pure future. Oh yeah, and he was Jewish. Sort of. Well, look, it's complicated. Alright, so everyone is aware of Hitler and Nazi Germany's obsession with racial purity and the belief in the superiority of the Aryan over other ethnicities. But what does this actually mean, and how did the so-called racially impure end up working in the Nazi war machine? First of all, who or what is an Aryan? Aryan was what various ancient, way long ago settlers called themselves in what is now Iran and northern India. But then only about 150 years ago, some Germans believed that they were descendants of these ancient settlers, speculating Aryans were some sort of great conquerors who were the reason civilization was brought to Europe. This false idea was combined with their own distorted misunderstandings of Darwinism, for Darwin believed we all have a shared ancestry. When the Nazis took power in Germany in the 1930s, they applied their ideas to the imagined races of the world. To keep it brief, and to simplify something as complex as this subject, they believed that the Aryans were superior and therefore had a right, if not a duty, to eliminate or subjugate other imagined races. Of course, there was a special hatred for Jews, but this superiority also applied to Roma people, Black and Asian populations, as well as other European groups like the Slavs. It was believed that these supposedly inferior groups could be identified by arbitrary things like skin color, as well as very specific physical characteristics like skull, nose, or jawline size and shape, while ignoring other body parts they had in common. The perfect Aryan was tall, had the perfect bone structure, light skin, and was idealized to have blonde hair and blue eyes, features that were plastered all over German propaganda. There's a bit of a problem with this, though. Most Germans didn't have blue eyes and blonde hair, which included none other than Hitler himself. So were these dark-haired and brown-eyed Germans somehow inferior? Not at all. The Nordic stereotype of blue eyes and blonde hair was an ideal, but not in any way the only acceptable characteristics. It was a sign of racial superiority, but not the only factor. No one was sent to Auschwitz for having brown eyes. That still didn't stop a popular joke from the time that the ideal Aryan was as slim as Göring, as tall as Goebbels, and as blonde as Hitler. So it's pretty clear then, according to Nazi racial identity, German and Nordic are superior, other ethnicities inferior, all part of a racial hierarchy that ends with Jews, Black people, and Asians at the bottom. If only it was that simple. In practice, this played out in a complex and inconsistent way. For example, there was a disdain for so-called Asiatics. However, during the Second World War, one of Germany's greatest allies was the very Asiatic nation of Japan. Hitler rationalized this by making the Japanese honorary Aryans, contradicting his own ideology. This wasn't the only time the Germans did away with their racial profiling. Of all the groups targeted by the Nazis, none were more vilified than the Jews. Of course, there had to be a definition of who was Jewish, which was codified into law. This is where the term Mischling enters the picture, meaning half-caste, mixed, or hybrid. This was the term applied to those of Jewish descent. German law classified Mischlings into two categories: first degree, which were those with two Jewish grandparents, and second degree, who only had one. 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents were considered fully Jewish. Conversion to Christianity didn't change the perception of these individuals and would be treated as Jews even if they were no longer practicing the Jewish faith. Only the conversion of an ancestor as far back in time as a great-grandparent would count towards having proper Aryan blood. These Mischlings were treated as second-class citizens, and they faced serious restrictions within German society. Of course, like every other racial policy of the Nazi regime, it was haphazard, contradictory, and sometimes flat-out ignored. For example, many Mischlings were discharged from the Wehrmacht based on their Jewish heritage, or were forced to be demoted to a lower rank. They were also not allowed to join the military later in the war. That said, a significant number managed to stay in their military positions, openly defying the policies, or were drafted anyway in spite of the law due to bureaucratic confusion. In one incident, a half-Jewish man was drafted. He wrote to the Wehrmacht several times, stating directly that he was not racially pure enough for service. His explanations were ignored, and he was conscripted anyway. Since things weren't confusing enough, many Mischlings and other non-Aryans were given exemptions from the discrimination laws. They were given German blood certificates, documents that made them full-blooded Germans by official decree and would be issued on a case-by-case basis and approved by Hitler. It would be made clear, however, that this status was entirely conditional and would be reevaluated at the end of hostilities. Around 2,000 men were given these exemptions, made Aryan by official decree rather than actual blood. In all, it's been estimated by scholar Brian Mark Rigg that up to 150,000 soldiers of partial Jewish descent served in the Wehrmacht during the war. These ranged in rank from lowly foot soldier to high-ranking officer, still serving despite their Jewish heritage, though these figures are still disputed by other scholars. It may be hard to understand why they would fight for a system that discriminated against them and also persecuted their families, even sending blood relatives to the extermination camps. Many Mischlings themselves were conflicted, but continued to serve anyway, their love of their homeland overriding their poor treatment, or for any other reason known only to them. Serving became more difficult in April of 1940 when Hitler decreed that all half-Jews be discharged from the Wehrmacht, though they could stay in the ranks if they applied for and received a German blood certificate. It also took a while for the policy to take effect because of the confusion in the aftermath of the Battle of France, and the real crackdown didn't take significant effect until the late summer. Even then, it was carried out haphazardly, with some officers flat out ignoring the order, or the search for Mischlings consisted of the soldiers signing a sworn statement that they were full-blooded Germans. Many Mischlings did this not out of deception, but because the German racial policies were so complex and convoluted that they thought they really were of German blood. And of course, many simply lied about their ancestry and stayed in their positions. This brings us to the soldier at the beginning of the video. Remember him? Well, he's an actual person. Meet Werner Goldberg. When the war broke out in September 1939, he was a month short of his 20th birthday and had served in the Reich's labor service, and in 1938 joined the German military. He fought in the invasion of Poland, on the border in France, and shortly after the outbreak of hostilities, his photograph was taken by a military photographer. The image was then sold and printed with the caption, "The Ideal German Soldier." The ideal German soldier, however, turned out to be a half-Jewish or a Mischling of the first degree. His father was a Jewish man who converted to Christianity, which Werner was unaware of, and therefore had two Jewish grandparents. After the April Declaration expelling half-Jews from military service, Goldberg was discharged from the military, where he then worked in his old job in a tailor's shop and managed to get contracts to make uniforms for the German military, which he did for the rest of the war. His prior service didn't shield his family from persecution. In 1942, his father was admitted to the hospital, which was soon raided by the Gestapo. As a Jew, he was then taken to a Jewish hospital in preparation for deportation to Auschwitz. On Christmas Eve, knowing the guards would be drunk or off-duty, Werner walked into the hospital, found his father, then walked out without the guards any wiser. He managed to keep his father out of their hands for the rest of the war, saving him twice again afterwards. Werner Goldberg's tale has both the pinnacle of Aryan supremacy as well as racial inferiority. Is just one example of the experience of many citizens in the German Third Reich.